It's called Your Thoughts Matter. It's a self-guided study about what is mental health, what's behavioral health, how do I notice it in me, and then what I really like about it is that it takes that energy of youth with a group out in community to do talks, to look at the mental health system in their own town, and then maybe even think about it as a career path.
A 2020 survey commissioned by the National 4-H Council found more than 66% of the teens surveyed believed that the COVID experience would have a lasting impact. On today's Sound Living, the state of teen mental health 1 year later. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. Extension Youth Development Specialist Elaine Johannes and James Roberson, Vice President of Behavioral Health Services at KVC Hospitals, are here to discuss the current situation for young people's mental health, coping, and resilience as they return to the classroom. Elaine, we talked about a year ago in regard to what it would be like for young people going through the pandemic, especially in terms of their mental health. And what we were discovering is the fact that it was tough. No matter how you put it, it was tough.
Yeah, Jeff, I reflect back on the conversation you and I had back in June or July of last year. And at that time, the National 4-H study of mental health had just come out, and it really hit you and I and people in Extension across the state really at the heart of our concern, because at that time, nationally, teenagers were saying they too knew that they were being impacted related to COVID-19, related to their feeling anxious and maybe some stress. But what was really of interest, 81% of teenagers wanted to talk about it, wanted to find an adult who would listen, but then they were unsure whether to talk to their parent, friends, or teachers or coaches about the way they felt. And so at that time, I think we were aware that there was a lot of bottled up emotion and concern. And so when we were thinking about now, what's happening now, teenagers, young people are returning to school. Some are prepared and could hardly wait. Some are just excited to be with friends, masked or not, depending upon what the school wants. But then on the other hand, some really excelled when they were at home taking courses or doing some summer camp. We realized that 4-H had moved to a tele-summer camp experience. So when I started thinking about how are our young people in the state doing, James came to the top of my list of people who understand what adolescents and what young people might be experiencing now, well after a year of when you and I had spoken earlier.
James is on a number of state committees and has some insight from the state level. So, James, what have you noticed so far, or I guess what is coming back to your committees?
So a lot of what we're hearing across the state of Kansas related directly to mental health treatment or the treatment of mental disease is that a lot of the kids, so we have really two groups. One group is kids coming in with brand new mental health symptoms that haven't been identified before. So similar to what Elaine was talking about, the pandemic impacted us all. And then for those groups where those symptoms are really becoming overwhelming or impacting day-to-day function, we see those kids needing more treatment faster. And then we also have to be really creative because you can't just walk into the mental health center anymore. We have to have connections. The other group are kids that were engaged in mental health treatment before. And with that group, we're seeing that their symptoms are more intense, more frequent. And the scary part of it is that what we know about mental health, it's a little bit different than physical health because we don't just look at organic. We look at the context of the child in the environment, and the pandemic has really changed all those environments. So those two dynamics, I think the state is looking at, one, how do we get in the community as fast as possible? I know my organization, KVC, has been doing community-based in-home services for a really long time, but that's for kids that have been in treatment for some time. We really have to get out in the community. We have to provide crisis services for kids where they're at. And I think the state of Kansas, working with private providers, has made a lot of progress over the last year in developing a plan to comprehensively treat mental health across the state of Kansas.
Would anxiety and depression be kind of at the top of that list then of the symptoms that they're suffering?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and we all experience anxiety and depression at some level. It's really a continuum. And so we are seeing both adults and children, and they're self-reporting that they're identifying they're experiencing a lot more anxiety. And then when we think about anxiety and how that impacts depression, sometimes the anxiety causes the depression, but sometimes they both are occurring simultaneously. So as a provider, you're looking at where does this stem from? Often it could be just COVID, but unfortunately a lot of what we're seeing is that the anxiety and the depression was there, and then now we have COVID on top of that. So we have to address COVID, get to the underlying concerns, work with the families, teachers, community members that engage with that youth, and we have to help them come up with solutions long term that'll be sustainable during a pandemic or outside of a pandemic.
James, you touched on something that I've actually heard over the last months from parents who have spoken with me. They're unsure whether this anxiety is something that happens just because the person is a teenager. Again, I think we all have had kids at home, and we've actually raised some teenagers into adulthood, and we understand what happens in that developmental stage where maybe the young person is not sure of their identity, not sure of how well they're performing, maybe compared to peers. Maybe even they're uncomfortable in their own skin because they're growing so quickly, and that all creates anxiety, and then the parents notice it. But what's interesting is that parents are noticing it now and then jumping into saying, well, that's a clinical issue. We got to get help. James, do you have any insights into what parents need to be observant of before they again assume that, well, we've got to get this kid into a clinical environment?
I would always start this conversation with families that I have not met a family that has regretted having their child engage in therapy. The ability to get your child in front of a professional who can do an assessment and tell you, hey, everything is okay, just keep doing what you're doing, or yeah, it's clinical, I think that's really, really valuable. Now, when I'm working with families, the two questions that I ask a parent is, number one, what your child is going through, is it sustainable? And if it's not sustainable from either the child's perspective or the parent's perspective, then we need to do something. If it's not sustainable within the family or at school, then let's do something. Let's go to work. Let's start solving problems. There are situations where we feel like that stress or that anxiety is really toxic, which means they're experiencing it in a way that it's negatively impacting their development as a child, but then we see that it has long-term impacts. And that's really when we put up the red flag. You know, this stress is negatively impacting you, and it will long-term if we don't do something different.
Elaine, the 4-H report also found that teens who were more resilient seemed to fare better. It also found out that teens are calling for some major change for mental health conversations. How do we get to that point? And do we know what kind of change they're really after?
Mm-hmm. In thinking about that report, which is, of course, a year old now, but there have been other reports coming out from national networks, mental health systems, I think it gets back to what the adult does, the behavior, the resilience that we demonstrate, and how we articulate, how we communicate our stress and managing it, coping, showing that we are humans. Family works, and we work together to cope and to continue towards development. I really like what James said about whether or not the behavior is sustainable. And that means to me, as that child grows up, what are the positive outcomes of what they're doing, or what are the potential negatives, harm to themselves. So it's really up to the adult, I think, to understand their role in modeling coping, talking about it, and watching the child be resilient and calling that out, looking for positive behaviors that they can support.
Is that where the state and extension could come into play then, as not therapists, but as a support mechanism, or teaching them how to be those supportive parents?
I will say yes. Not only supportive, but consistent. I really am excited, that's a different word, isn't it, but pleased that the education system, our own Kansas State Board of Education, is putting funding out across the state to put mental health professionals in a lot of schools. That to me is a sign of strength and consistency and support, especially out in our rural areas where, again, we don't have a lot of practitioners or behavioral scientists out there usually. But with these people out in the schools now, attracting more counselors, more social workers, more mental health professionals, placing them in the school during the school day, I think that provides not only that positive support, but consistency.
Is it also possible then that the teens are more open to receiving help? They're starting to ask for help, whereas before there was a little bit of stigma attached with mental health.
I'll say yes, but James, I'm going to pitch it over to you. Are you seeing that people are starting to talk about it more, talk about mental health as just part of life? And is this something that our teenagers are also talking more freely about?
Yeah, and I think where we started with the 4-H report on teen mental health is a really good example of teenagers today really understanding themselves more, understanding their own mental health more, and then being more accepting of that. So where does that come from? I mean, that comes from what you were just talking about. If they're hearing about it from early age, kindergarten, first grade, again, their brains are developing. So then they begin to understand themselves as more than just wants, desires, behaviors, but they really understand, like, today I'm feeling well and I'm excited and I have energy, and then today I don't. So they're able to articulate that much better probably than the generations before them. And that's a huge part. Awareness is number one. If we understand that things are changing, then we can get in front of problems. We're able to better articulate and communicate. And we kind of get away from, and we've seen a lot of this during the pandemic, where it's like, it's black and white. I'm well, I'm not well. I need help, I don't need help. It's just not that clean. We want to get as far away from that as we can, and we want everybody to have kind of a sophisticated understanding of how they're experiencing the world, and then understand how everyone around them supports that. And so, yes, I do think teens are ready. I think they're eager. I think we, as providers, as a state system, we owe them solutions so that they can be their best selves and, live a healthy, long life.
What I really like about what you've said, and you and I have spoken about this, is that how 4-H as a youth development system has kind of taken this on too. K-State Extension is excited, there's that word again, to take a curriculum that has come out of a sister 4-H system from Ohio State University. It's a curriculum for 4-H clubs, but other youth, and it's called Your Thoughts Matter. And it's a self-guided study about what is mental health, what's behavioral health, how do I notice it in me? And then what I really like about it is that it takes that energy of youth with a group out in community to do talks, to look at the mental health system in their own town, and then maybe even think about it as a career path. It's almost like growing your own. Yes, it's from the Buckeye State. Yes, it's Ohio State University for now, but we're going to Kansify it, and we're going to make it something that I think we can inspire youth to go into the field.
Well, in addition to that, there's also a number of resources out there, a number of webinars also taking place. I think KVC does webinars as well.
We do. Starting on September 13th, we're going to have 3 live webinars in September where we're going to dig into this topic. So we're going to talk about the impact of the pandemic on mental health, and I'll be presenting myself really focused on resilience and how parents can help build those skills, and really, too, how providers can give parents the tools they need to build those skills. And so if you go to hospitals.kvc.org, you'll see a large banner where you can sign up for the webinar. We are doing CEUs for anybody who participates in the live webinar.
And I would imagine, Elaine, you will encourage our extension agents to take part in that as well.
Yes, I'll encourage any of our people in our K-State Research Extension System to log on and take some of those webinars.
That's K-State Research and Extension Youth Development Specialist Elaine Johannes and James Roberson, Vice President of Behavioral Health Services at KVC Hospitals, with an update on the state of teen mental health. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.